Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you want to have class on Monday?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Absolutely. We're gonna go right to the end.
Is there class on Wednesday?
There is. Yeah. Wednesday's the last day. We're gonna take it. We're gonna use every possible moment. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Depends how it goes today.
I did. But it's like I was wearing
No. Okay. I don't suppose anyone has a AA battery, do you? I know. You think they would come through and occasionally like replenish the battery supply for these microphones, but I don't know. All right, we'll do what we can. I might have to shout. Da 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 da. If only I could patch the audio from the live stream through the speakers in the classroom. I'm sure that's possible somehow, but not today. Okay, so I don't think this mic is going to work very well because the battery is basically dead. Showing a red light. I should just carry AA batteries with me everywhere. Okay, so we're going to keep going talking about kind of Height's take on what's going on with young people and particularly smartphones and social media. And then we'll see where we get today. You know, I know we have 2 classes after today. So on Monday and Wednesday, and Wednesday should be just a review. So let's go. Okay, this makes me think of how girls experience in a bathroom at a club where everyone briefly becomes best friends, whereas men don't make those same types of connections. Cool. Like, how do you know what happens in both? I don't know. Okay, I'm good. Do you think that we see people manifesting symptoms of dissociative identity disorder due to the movie Split? I doubt enough people have seen the movie Split for that to be the catalyst. I think it's more social media, especially TikTok. Oh, right. Oh, this. Okay. And to clarify, people who experience sociogenic illnesses actually believe they have an illness, or do they? No. People who are, I mean, for the most part, people with sociogenic illnesses, they're experiencing real symptoms. They're just not coming from the place you would expect, right? Like Tourette's. When they're having Tourette's-like symptoms, right, and they're yelling, you know, HH, which we talked about last time, but I won't say again because I had to appeal some flags on my YouTube channel, which is super fun and doesn't take any time. Right, they actually believe that this is happening to them. They manifest real symptoms, right? We have every piece of evidence that people who, you know, danced themselves to death in the Middle Ages really thought that it was some kind of disease, you know, some dancing illness, and it manifests in real ways, right? You know, your mind makes it real. Just a Matrix quote, I guess. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so this is where we ended off, right? Talking about harassment of girls online. And obviously, you know, we talked a little bit about how predators will easily find, right? Adult men prey on teen girls, you know, which can lead to things like trafficking, exploitation in all sorts of cases, right? Broadly based on, again, this kind of communion function that girls want. And, you know, they want the most friends, they want the most followers, so they friend people back, they open themselves up to these things. and male peers who also, exploit teen girls sexually online. Okay, so here we come to this. Social media, right? When we talked about this a little bit, and someone asked a question regards to people who have online communities, does it make up for the lack of in-person communities? And it doesn't seem to, right? So what we see, social media increases the number, right, of connections that people have, but reduces the quality of those connections, right? So you get much more in the way of weak ties. We talked about this a little bit. I wrote it out on a slide, right? Less people are going to actually come and help you and actually be of use. You have less deep connections, right? These are not people you know very well. And you have more of these kinds of ties, right? We have more sending hugs and less, hey, just hold on there, I'll come pick you up, or I'll bring you a casserole, or while you guys are going through marriage trouble, you can sleep on our couch or in our spare bedroom, or those kinds of things, right? So teens have cut back on in-person time, right? We've talked about this lots. They're spending less time together than ever before, and their relationships have suffered. And I think where Height and Twengi, they are focused on friends, right? They're focused on, friends. I think we should also kind of expand our thinking here to our trusted adults, right? Because I think we've seen in some of the other research we've looked at that trusted adults matter tremendously. And our teens have cut back on both of these things, right? They're spending less time with friends, and right, this chart shows, have a few close friends. That number has gone down, right? It really tanked for boys, which is crazy, right? Percent of students, used to be up past 70, right around here, 75 here. Girls, it was 80, and it's tanked for both. But boys, seem to be much lonelier than girls, or have fewer close friends than girls, and often feel lonely, right? Girls, we see that spike again through our great rewiring. When smartphones are changing the way our brains work, girls' loneliness spiked. Boys did as well. It just didn't spike as hard. It started from a lower spot, and it remains lower. But we have 40-ish% of girls saying they often feel lonely. Okay. All right. So what's happening to boys? And I wanted to have a whole unit on men and boys, and I just have not. We ran out of time, and I haven't had time to put it together completely. So future generations of this class will get it. I'm sorry not to give you the full experience. Okay, so what's happening to boys? According to Height, boys have followed a different path. Girls have more of our internalizing disorders, right? So this is depression, anxiety. We see more of this amongst girls, right? But boys are not exactly doing great either, right? They have higher rates of internalizing disorders, but it's still lower than girls. But they also, I guess what we see more with boys is increased evidence of pulling away from the real world, right? So the time spent with friends started to decline earlier for boys in the early 2000s and accelerated for, in the 2010s. So it's been a longer burn, right? The decline in time spent with friends for boys has been this kind of long and slowly building process. For girls, the kind of decline was more compacted, but they've both experienced similar things. And okay, this is a fun chart, right? Percentage of high school seniors who agree or mostly agree with the statement, people like me don't have much of a chance at a successful life, right? We see again, here's our great rewiring. Was pretty low, kind of for girls, bounced around 5%, from the 70s to 2009, and then takes a big jump to around 10% of girls, and probably kind of mid-low teens for boys, right? You're looking at, 12, 13%. saying that people like them have no chance, at a successful life. Excuse me. The real world, right? So we talked a little bit about this earlier in the course, when we talked about work. The real world started to change in the 1970s to make it less hospitable for boys and young men. And specifically, in large part, we see a shift to, a service-based economy away from things like manufacturing, construction, mining, logging, right? These agriculture, all of these jobs that used to employ the bulk of men, right? The number of people employed in those things has declined, leaving less of those kind of traditionally masculine jobs available. So men have, in some ways struggled a lot to adapt to a service-based world, right? They're just less temperamentally oriented to it in a lot of ways, right? A lot of men and boys, fundamentally they're sort of kinetic in their way of understanding the world and navigating through it, right? They like to build things, they like to be physically involved in things, and careers that prize strength, things like 3D visualization are really, really good. And I have a few friends, I have one friend in particular, he works in construction, he's a plumber, and it's just fascinating for me to watch his mind work, because I will describe something that I want in principle. I'm like, I would like some shelving here. And he can, I look at it and I'm like, I don't know how to make that happen. And he just kind of if he talks me through his process, he's like, okay, this, right? He can, without it being there, he can see it in 3D space. And I can't, because I have a stupid non-3D brain. I can barely drive half the time because I can't map things out in my head, which is where GPS is my best friend. But yeah, I cannot visualize things in 3 dimensions. Even IKEA furniture challenges me at the best of times. It's just like, how do these pieces go together? This drawing seems to tell me. This drawing makes no sense. But yeah, to watch my friend Matt work, it's just like, he sees it in a different way. And this was, a world in the, up to the 1970s that prized a lot of those skills. And the world today definitely doesn't. But what has happened, right? And if we think again about, our two kind of modes, right? Communion and agency. Now, when we talked about agency for boys, the digital world gives them a way to do agency building activities, such as exploring, competing, playing at war, right? Mastering skills, and seeing naked women, all on increasingly portable screens, right? So all things that men tend to prize. And again, there's been some cultural changes here as well, right? Where if you think of some of the discourses around things like toxic masculinity, right? There's been sort of pushes against, I don't want to say like toxic, what people call toxic masculinity is good, but things like playing at war, right? That kind of competitive, kind of dominating kind of orientation that a lot of men have. It used to be something like kids would play at war, right? You'd have snowball fights in the schoolyard. A lot of that has been kind of thoroughly blocked, right? And I mean, again, my wife's an elementary school teacher, and the number of rules that they apparently have for playing soccer at school, I'm just like, okay, you've now taken the joy out of school-based soccer, right? It's like, it's just not any fun anymore. So a lot of those things that boys really like to do have been sort of, removed or mediated, and some of the safetyism that we have kind of pushes against it as well. I mean, to the point where I remember in his book, I think it's Boys on the Brink, Leonard Sachs, I can never get the two titles right, Boys on the Brink, he's like, look, banning snowball fights is dumb. You should have a zone of snowball fights at every school, in every schoolyard, and the kids that want to throw snowballs go into that zone, and anyone who doesn't stays out of that zone, and they don't get hit with snowballs. But you should just let kids have snowball fights. And I kind of agree, because it's always seemed a little dumb to me. And I know they tell you, like, what if there's a piece of ice? It could tear someone's eyeball out. And I'm like, okay, show me the last time that actually happened, and I will show you a lie. Okay, So this is a book I really wanted to talk about. We'll talk about it just briefly here. So Richard Reeve, he wrote this book of boys and men. It's a really, really interesting book, why the modern male is struggling, why it matters, and what to do about it, right? Okay, so caused by, structural and economic changes that made physical strength less valuable. We've talked about that. Heavy labor, especially agriculture, manufacturing, has been replaced by the service industry. And what do we see, right? For this quote from Hannah Rosin in, I think it's this book, The End of Men. Well, I'll read that comment in a sec. For the first time in American history, the balance of the workforce tipped towards women, who continue to occupy around half the nation's job. At every educational level, girls are surpassing boys, right? They have higher rates of ADHD. Boys get lower grades. They have higher rates of ADHD, more likely to be unable to read. They are less likely to graduate from high school, in part because they are 3 times as likely as girls to be expelled and suspended along the way. And again, if you want to talk about social justice, these effects are most notable down the socioeconomic ladder, right? So the poorer you get, the more of a problem this is. And again, money can fix a lot of things. And this is one of the points that, now I'm forgetting her name. It's escaping me. The two-parent privilege. Why is her name escaping me? Melissa Kearney. Melissa Kearney makes, right? Like, the kids of parents who get divorced, who have lots of money, are going to be fine because their parents can basically pay the problems away for the most part. It's when you go down that socioeconomic ladder that the effects are most pronounced. Boys in richer families, right? Parents can pay for counseling, for ADHD medication, for extra tutoring, for all of these things to help with this, send their kids to better schools, all of this kind of stuff. But as you go down that socioeconomic ladder, families are less able to help their boys do well. Okay. And this one, I think, is an interesting quote from Richard Reeve, and I think this is right. A world of floundering men is unlikely to be a world of flourishing women, right? In some sense, men and women do well together or they don't, but it's not, in a sense, a zero-sum game. If both of them were doing better, obviously things like, marriageability would be better, relationships would be easier to form, households would come together more easily, and you probably wouldn't have half of women in Canada saying they wish they had more children if only they'd met their, future spouse earlier or things like that. So, you worked a summer camp a few summers ago, and you see this lack of agency in games that the supervisor gave us to play with the kids. They are really boring, right? It's like, the games have to be so incredibly safe, right? And again, some of this is the litigious nature of our society, right? What if your kid gets injured at the summer camp? The camp might get sued out of existence. But yeah, they're very lacking in sort of agency building and actually letting people get scraped up. Okay, so some of the causes, right? Okay, so declines in jobs that reward strength. An educational system that prizes the ability to sit still and listen, right? Again, this is an argument, I guess it's a well-worn argument. I know Leonard Sachs has made this one in his book, Why Gender Matters, where he advocates different approaches to education for boys and girls. But that basically, an educational system that prizes the ability to sit and listen often works better for girls, right? Who tend to be a little bit better at this, right? And again, it's not to say that things like ADHD doesn't exist in girls. It's just, it's less problematic, right? And I mean, I don't want to use my children as examples all the time. My daughter, when she was little, you could sit her down with us in a circle of toys, and she would play there for like 3 hours, right? You could do the same thing with my son, and he would play there for 3 minutes before throwing them, breaking something, climbing on something, jumping off something, calling you, trying to climb on your back, and any number of things, right? My daughter did those things too, but she was much more able to entertain herself, whereas my boys have definitely been more, shall we say, kinetic. Okay, the other one, I will not miss you, trucks that constantly back up. A decline in the available positive role models. And again, we see this increasingly down that socioeconomic ladder, right? And if you remember, one of the things that Kearney talked about in her book on marriage, right, is something like 40% of children in the US today are born to fathers that offer no resources to their families, right? So basically, they're non-marriageable. They don't have jobs. They're not terribly positive role models. We're seeing declines in things like positive male role models. And think here again, I don't want to keep harping on the same thing, but our trusted adults, right? As we've deinstitutionalized young people, they've left religious communities, they've left the bowling league, they play less sports and all of these things. Where would you potentially find, male role models in all of those places? And in some senses, you're replacing them with someone like Mr. Beast or other influencers, which are not the same thing, right? Okay. Other psychological factors. We talked about safetyism, right? Less time outside. This tendency to say the outside world is dangerous. Let's keep them inside and on screens, which has pushed boys, into multiplayer online games. Less in-person contact, more time with just strangers, and less kind of kinetic action. Okay. This slide makes me sad. Okay, so increasingly, we're seeing in, our teens and emerging adult men, a sort of failure to launch, right? A failure, I guess, kind of getting stuck in in emerging adulthood or in a kind of, longer adolescence, right? They're in adolescence for longer, right? So young men more likely to live with their parents, 27% versus 17% in the US. Boys are also increasingly vulnerable to becoming total shut-ins. And this is one of these really weird things. And I always think, weirdly, Japan, for whatever reason, seems like it's always something like 10 to 15 years ahead of North America in terms of social trends. So for example, change my pen to yellow, things like our trends in fertility, right? So we talked a lot about fertility earlier in the course. Cannot see that at all. That did not work out. I'll go back to red. I don't know if that works. Yeah. Fertility, right? Japan was there much earlier, right? Japan's kind of declines in fertility started earlier, and other social trends in Japan tend to start a little bit earlier than here as well. So in the kind of 1990s, we started to see a trend of young Japanese men essentially becoming total shut-ins. So as their economic opportunities decline with a stagnating Japanese economy, right? The Japanese economy has basically been stuck in a sort of stagnation, like you would call it a secular stagnation in economic terms, for like 30 years, right? It's been a really long time that's been kind of stuck there with, very little growth, super low interest rates, and all of that stuff. As a lot of economic opportunities evaporated for young men, what they saw was young men sort of retreating into their childhood bedrooms. So much so that they came up with a term for it, which is hikikomori, right? We have a slightly different term for it, often in North America. They refer to them as NEET, which is not engaged in employment, education, and I can't remember the T. I'm blanking on what the acronym means, or training. Not engaged in education, employment, or training, right? So this is, we use this slightly different term. So Japanese people, hikikomori, NEET in North America, right? So in the past, this would have been virtually impossible, since going into your bedroom would leave you intensely bored, right? Staying at home would be intensely boring. And so eventually people would come out of it, right? Eventually people would be like, man, this is really far too boring for me to remain here. I need to get my act together, figure something out, kind of work on myself or whatever. But with the internet, right, and social media, and especially online video games, it becomes increasingly possible to just retreat into kind of like being almost a shut-in, right? And this is, not incidentally where you get, incels as well, right? This is the same kind of social phenomenon. Struggling men, retreating, feeling frustrated. Incels have gross ideas, but it comes out of the same sort of thing, right? And some young men in the West are emulating this lifestyle. And I think what's most kind of troubling is you're seeing some of their social media kind of channels and the tools that they use, actually where you have online communities sort of promoting it, right? In the same way as we saw in the 2000s, right? You had, it's Tumblr, right? On Tumblr, girls were promoting kind of eating disorder culture, right? What they would call, like they had Anna and Mia, or anorexia and bulimia kind of blogs, where they would promote, these things as lifestyles rather than eating disorders. You're seeing the same thing kind of happening to young men, where things like hikikomori are being, basically there are people communicating with each other on Reddit, that hive of scum and villainy, 4chan and 8chan, which are even greater hives of scum and villainy, and promoting this as a valid lifestyle that people could, theoretically live, isolated. So there's an ideology that goes with it. Okay. So this is where chart beats you to death again. Sorry about the 3 charts. So teens, especially boys, increasingly live lives free of risk, even small ones, right? And what do we see, right? Hospital admissions for unintentional injuries have been plummeting, right? From, essentially for our youngest categories, right? So our 10 to 19 and 20 to 29-year-old, right? We've seen their hospitalizations decline quite a bit. Now for girls, this is true as well, but we'll say, how shall we say? There's whole Reddit channels and dedicated to, I think it's called Why Men Die Young, which is just a Reddit channel with a bunch of videos of men doing incredibly stupid things, like trying to, standing on the roof of a car and trying to jump over a log that crosses a road, right? And then running into it, falling down and getting injured, right? Boys are much more likely to take these kinds of risks. It might be stupidity, I don't know, or just that, risk tolerance. But we're seeing far less of that, right? Far less unintentional injuries. We see, we talk about our internalizing and externalizing symptoms. We see, right? So externalizing is like aggression, right? Like outward aggression. Outward aggression is going down amongst boys, whereas those internalizing things, right? Depression, anxiety, self-derogation going up. Girls, similar story. They were always less aggressive, so less externalizing. That's dropped. Look at that internalizing. Wow, that's gone up a lot. And enjoyment in taking risks, right? For girls, it's relatively unchanged. But for boys, they're kind of at the lowest ebb since the early 90s. Okay, so some good points. We have fewer injuries, fewer deaths, fewer unplanned pregnancies. I always say, this was funny because I used to use a textbook for this course. And I dropped it last year because I was like, it was 10 years old, right? Published in 2015. And I was like, this is so out of date, it doesn't even matter anymore. And then the publisher contacted me with a new draft of it. And it was funny because one of the big things they talked about was like how we avoid unplanned teen pregnancies. And I was like, anyone who knows the literature on teen pregnancies knows that they are at their lowest level ever, right? It is such a small thing that it basically, from a social perspective, doesn't happen, right? I know there are unplanned teen pregnancies. They're just such a minor phenomenon. And I wrote back to the publisher as part of my review. I'm like, it doesn't even make sense to talk about this as a risk because it barely happens anymore. And I cited the Canadian statistics, and it's like, like I said, it barely exists anymore. So unplanned pregnancies, especially for teenagers, barely happens because you can't get pregnant if you're, sitting at home watching Netflix by yourself. Unless something has fundamentally changed. Okay. But what height says is there's also a lot fewer chances to learn and grow, right? These injuries teach you things. They are, good in some sense. Breaking your arm, it doesn't feel good, but you grow from it, right? And you learn resilience and, not to do the thing that caused you to break your arm and all of that fun stuff. I've never broken my arm. I've broken my nose 3 times, but that's neither here nor there. Taught me not to ride a jet ski with my friend Matt. He elbowed me in the face and broke my nose. Have I heard or watched of Adolescence on Netflix? The realistic, more extreme effects is sort of... I have heard about it. I have not watched it yet. I've been teaching 5 classes this semester. I have no time, but it's on my to-watch list at some point. All right. Sounds interesting. Okay. And now, of course, the virtual world. How am I doing for time here? Ooh. We're doing okay. Okay. So the virtual world. Video games have always been the purview of boys, right? Principally. I know there are girls who play video games, and gaming, if we look at it as an overall phenomenon, way more girls are playing video games now. But the type of video games girls play is still considerably different. Girls are much more likely to play, mobile games on their phones than, AAA games on a PC or a console. Okay, so games were always, even back in the early days, right? The Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, early PlayStations. It was always more exciting for boys. Boys were always more into it. But things got way more intense in the early 2000s. So graphics got better, right? You had the launch of 2 particular consoles, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, within about a year of each other. And these had, much, much better graphics than any of the generations before, more likely 3D. They also went online, right? You got, the origins of, Xbox Live and PSN. At this point, they really hit the kind of mainstream. There had been online games before. They were principally PC games, and PCs were pretty expensive. The other thing that happened in the early 2000s is the internet got a whole ton faster, especially this one. You can thank the Australians for that. Australia created Wi-Fi. So every time you have a Wi-Fi problem, you can curse Australia. Or every time you can connect without plugging into a wall, you can thank Australia. It's quite a technology when you actually look into it, how you have to fragment data to make it go through walls. Quite a cool thing. Wi-Fi, liberated devices from having to be plugged into a wall and these really, detailed Ethernet systems where you have to plug everything in. So it freed the internet to move to different spaces, and it made it a lot faster. You also got, laptops, which got much better, much lighter, and had better battery life. And, you got some other things that appeared on the internet. And especially in this era, you get the origins of, two sites, Pornhub and YouTube, both of which, really push video content in major ways. Okay, so online gaming got much better, much more exciting. And you got, titles that really took advantage of this, like Call of Duty, right? That people, boys really wanted to play. And again, connected with that, war-making impulse that they have. Okay, or playing at war, right? So smartphones also accelerated how much attention could be extracted from boys, right, by making screens pervasive. And this one I think is really interesting. And I've kind of talked about this a little bit. Boys' status negotiations start to shift online, right? And I mean, like I said, I've seen this with my 12-year-old, right? As soon as he got the game Fortnite, he was on there with all of his friends, and it was like this constant comparison. Who's the best? Who was winning? Who had the most achievements, right? Who had the highest level, right? I have to be on, Dad, I have to play for another hour, because if I don't, Callum is going to pass me. Like he's already almost at the same level as me, and he's going to pass me because his parents don't limit his time on the game. So I just need to play for 1 more, 3 more, 5 more, 10 more hours, right? And there were days, right, where, where it was like, okay, whatever, we'll just give you a free day, a yes day. You can play as much as you want. It was like 12 hours of Fortnite, right? It's crazy stuff. And the second so we banned Fortnite because it had gone out of control. And, there was like mood problems and yelling and breaking stuff. And we're like, okay, it's time to go to bed. And he would like try to kick his door in. He got so mad that he'd been cut off. And he's usually a very mellow kid. So we shut it down, and all of a sudden he's changed friend groups at school because he's now with the boys who aren't allowed to play Fortnite. And I'm not kidding. Like, this is how it worked. All these status negotiations shifted online, and it was all like, who's there? And they were having fights at school about stuff that happened online. It was crazy, right? Because it's all shifted online to these online games. And what Height says is boys now wander through a bazaar of games, videos, the videos, online communities, right, especially on Reddit, and pornography, right? Constant online stimulation becomes possible, and this is like, this is dopamine. Lots of boys are in a kind of dopamine loop where the real world seems really, really boring. What this tends to lead to eventually, too, is gambling apps, and dating apps, right? Like Tinder, right? With the constant swiping. So why did I make the sound? I don't know. I've never used Tinder. Does it make a sound? I have no idea. Nor do I care. It actually sounds like a horrible experience. All right, so porn. Well, I know. You're probably like, didn't we talk enough about pornography earlier in the course? And the answer to your question is no. Pornography, right? What Height says is it hijacks some deep evolutionary drives in boys, right? So, evolution made things alluring by giving bursts of dopamine. One of those things for boys, right, especially as they hit puberty, is looking at naked women, right? Now, looking at naked women used to be relatively hard, right? Either you had to, get one, hopefully through legitimate means, and that requires some effort, or you had to buy pornography, which was difficult, right? Because it was, and even, until the early 2000s, right, online porn hadn't quite hit its apogee yet. You had to like go to like some seedy shop in an industrial district and buy, pornographic magazines, and you could only do that if you were an adult. So what Height says, this motivated boys to take risks, like talking to girls or asking girls to dance, right? Encountering real women in real places, potentially in hopes, that one of them would, let you look at them or something like that. Once boys get laptops and high-speed internet, porn takes over, right? Especially once those screens can move into private spaces. It's not, as prevalent when you have the big desktop computers that are plugged into the wall to get the internet. Wi-Fi and laptops and smartphones really make this possible. And smartphones intensify this problem because they make porn pervasive, right? And it's in your pocket. So, porn is so easy, right? Hey, what should we talk about? Should we talk about cheap sex? I know, I just keep referencing other stuff from the course. Cheap sex, right? Porn is so easy, it can lead boys to choose the easy path rather than trying to engage in the risk of actually talking to women, right? And I like this. Porn separates the evolved lure, sexual pleasure, from its real world reward, a sexual relationship. Potentially making boys who are heavy users turn into men who are less able to find sex, love, intimacy, and marriage in the real world, right? So what does that lead to potentially, right? Sex recession, low marriageability. Because you're not working on yourself, right? To make yourself worthwhile for women to consider you, right? To be marriageable, to be relationship material. And again, that throws off these relationship balances in weird ways that benefit certain men at the expense of others, right? We talked about this, right? That marriageable men now are vastly outnumbered in the relationship market by marriage-oriented women. And so they are in the driver's seat of relationships, giving them a lot of power to string women along, right? To use them for sex without committing to them in relationships. Okay, now this is the one that I'm really scared of. This could get worse with AI girlfriends. And in the last year, we've seen, and I swear to God, this is the stupidest thing in the world, and yet, our lizard brains are real dumb. We've seen a proliferation of these apps, all over the place. All the way from see, this is because I'm weird and I start researching these things. Now all of the ads I see on Twitter is all for AI girlfriend apps. It's just constantly, and I'm like, ooh, interesting. What is this? And I click on it oh, that's what that is. Now these AI girlfriend apps are kind of interesting, right? They're pretty crude at first, but already you can see that they're getting more sophisticated. And they basically are, almost like a chat bot, like a phone chat that you can have with these AI avatars. And that it's that large learning model, right? The same thing as ChatGPT. It's basically learning about you as you interact with them. And it'll sort of, and feeding it through what it knows about probably pornography, to be honest. And then basically, spitting out responses to you like a relationship. Now, could this come to replace actual people? We already have sort of early cases of men and boys falling in love with these digital avatars, right? So again, pushing people away from, I'm sorry, this might be harder to get a date in the future because everybody's going to be, on their phone chatting with their AI girlfriend. What a dystopian hell we've created. All right. If only Orwell could have seen this, he would have been shocked. Okay. Oh, daily porn use. Swedish 12th grade boys, right? 2004, percent of students, about 10, more or less daily, up to about 25% by 2014. I guarantee you it's much higher now. And girls, don't use porn nearly as much. Okay, I am so running out of time. That's okay. So, height is a little bit less definitive about video games because the research on video games is a bit mixed, right? Specifically, we can say one of the things that it does do is it tends to increase self-esteem in boys, right? As they get good at a video game, right? And if you dump hundreds or thousands of hours into a video game, you will eventually get better at it. You might not be, I don't know, what's the top rank in Fortnite, Unreal or something like that. You might not make it to that level, but you could definitely improve, right? And that will raise your self-esteem. You're going to feel better about yourself. You're going to feel that sense of accomplishment. But he identifies two big harms. Gaming addiction, right? And some subset of boys are compulsive gamers, right? They cannot stop and they are going to get upset. And again, this tracks really strongly with certain things like ADHD, right? ADHD personality types are going to be much more susceptible to gaming addiction. But the other one, he says, is opportunity cost. So basically, every second you spend in a video game is a second you're not spending in the real world, right? You're not building relationships You're not going out to, play sports, go to a religious service or a religious institution, build relationships with trusted adults or friends, right? You are, build your physical capabilities, right? Get healthier, exercise, all of those things. When you're on a screen, you're basically foregoing a lot of those things to play the video game, right? And whatever you could be doing in that time, reading, learning a skill, building a relationship, asking a girl out on a date, right? You spend, playing video games. Okay. So, both of them, right? Both Gen Z boys and girls, according to Haidt, in different ways, are struggling to put down roots in the real world, right? In real world communities, right? They're deeply deinstitutionalized, right? They're in these online spaces, not in real world spaces. They're failing to put down roots in communities populated by known individuals who will be there 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. Increasingly, their lives are made up of shifting groups of unknown people, right? Online, in online communities, sitting behind, avatars, and these sorts of things. And these are not the same, right? These two things are not equivalent. Online communities are not equivalent to these shifting online groups. Online communities are not, equivalent to these communities populated by known individuals who are going to be there, who are consistent, right? You can build relationships with, who are going to ask you about how your life is going, and all of this kind of stuff. And what Haidt says, kind of echoing Durkheim, is that our Gen Zs are suffering from anomie, right? That disconnection from society and social norms like no generation before. And right, we see, again, here's our great rewiring, right? This period here, and what we see, a big jump for both boys and girls in those who report that life often feels meaningless, right? Okay, I'll leave it there. I'll stop there for today. I got through my boys, I got through our girls, we got through our boys, and we'll conclude the course on Monday and kind of go from there. But we will leave, this perfectly happy topic, which I'm sure you all feel much better about the world after talking about it. We'll leave to conclude with, well, hopefully a message of hope. Friday! It's the last Friday of the semester. Woo!
Real. Well, I guess I'm in sociology.
Everything is garbage.
Yeah.
What's that?
The future